The subject of this lecture is supply and demand and the market. I want to start off this little mini lecture really with an old joke in economics, and it goes something like this. And you've probably heard of it before if you've taken another economics class. But the popular joke is that if you can teach a parrot to say supply and demand, you've taught him to become an economist. Now, I certainly hope that's not true, because if it is true, we economists are going to be out of a job in a hurry. But I think at some level it is true, in the sense that a little bit of supply and demand knowledge, a little bit of understanding of markets and how they work, can really go a very long way to explaining a lot of economic behavior. So if there's any one sort of concept or one sort of idea that you would want to get down and learn fairly well, it would be supply and demand in the market, because this knowledge, I think, will help you with really all of the rest of the things that you're going to learn in an economics course, regardless if it's a macro course or a micro course or even a more advanced course. So a little bit of supply and demand can go really pretty far. What I'd like to do is first talk about demand, and then we'll talk about supply. But before we jump into that, it's important to know who the players are and what hats they wear in the economy. You've no doubt taken a look at the circular flow diagram, so I'm not going to bore you with those details. But let's first take a look at who's doing the demanding. Now, if we're talking about the goods market, and that's going to be our central focus today, even though there are other markets. There's the labor market, there are other resource markets, there's the capital market and the land market. But we're going to focus on the goods market, the goods and services market. Now, the folks that are doing the demanding in that market, of course, are going to be households, individuals. On the supply side, the people that are going to be doing the supplying, or the entity in the economy that's going to be doing the supplying, of course, are going to be the firms. And the reason why I stress this is because in other types of markets, those hats may actually switch. For example, in the labor market, it's not the consumer that's doing the demanding. Actually, it's the firm that's doing the demanding. Firms demand labor. And it's not firms that are doing the supplying in the labor market, but rather the consumer. The household is actually supplying their labor to the labor market. But in our case, we're going to focus on the goods market. So let's start with demand. Now, given that we don't have the benefit of a supply and demand diagram, because this is an audio lecture, but that's okay because you'll have other video lectures to accompany this, but sometimes it's good to think about these things in your head without using a graph or without using the chalkboard. And that is to just think, what is meant by demand? Well, I think at a very basic level, for example, at the level of a child's thinking, it's pretty straightforward. And I think most children, and not little children, of course, but adolescents or teenagers, don't really have much trouble with this whole idea of the law of demand. And that is, when prices are relatively high, we tend to buy less of something. We tend to economize, buy fewer goods or fewer services at higher prices. And when prices fall, we tend to buy more. We tend to indulge. Why? Because we can. We have the ability and the power to consume more goods and services at lower prices. This is very intuitive. It's straightforward. In fact, we don't really need a lesson on this. In fact, it's almost sort of embarrassing to talk about it because out of fear of insulting someone's intelligence. But there's really three things going on when the price of a good falls. And I think it's important to sort of outline what those three things are. The first is what we call the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, what is this all about? Well, this basically says that as you consume more and more units of a good, eventually you're going to reach some point where you're going to get less and less satisfaction from consuming additional units of that good. Economists put that in different terms. We call it utility. All right, we say we get less and less utility from consuming a particular good. Now, if this is true, if your utility is falling or your marginal utility is falling, that is, your utility on the next good is diminishing as you're consuming more and more units of a good, then the only way you could actually sort of convince somebody to consume more of it is if you lowered the price. Because what would this do? It would sort of bolster the bang for the buck that you're getting from that good. And so that's one sort of explanation for the downward sloping nature of the demand curve, for the reason why at lower prices you have higher quantity demanded. But there's another explanation in economics that we refer to as the substitution effect, and that is, as the price of a good falls, it becomes relatively less expensive compared to everything else in your market basket. So you tend to consume more of that good because it's relatively cheaper compared to everything else, and less of other goods. So you tend to substitute away from those other goods towards the good that's now relatively cheaper. And vice versa, if the price of that good rises, it becomes relatively more expensive, and you tend to move away from consumption of that good towards other goods. So you tend to economize. So that's called the substitution effect. And then the last effect is what we refer to as the income effect. And that is, as the price of a good falls, your real income goes up. Now, what is that whole business of real income? What that is the purchasing power of your income. Your income now goes further because the price of this particular good has fallen. And as a consequence, since you have more real income, you'll tend to purchase more of the good in question. Why? Because you can afford to do so. So we have all three of those things sort of packaged together. Now I want to give you some sort of real life applications of each one of these things, just in case you're thinking this is just a sort of pure academic exercise. Let's take, for example, the case of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now I want you to think about two different types of goods here. Let's imagine two different kinds of vending machines. Newspaper vending machines and canned cold beverages that are sold in vending machines. You know, the big tall machines where you put coins in. Now these are remarkably different types of vending machines. Let's take a look at the newspaper vending machine. Now those are usually pretty much purely mechanical. There's usually no electronic apparatuses in a newspaper vending machine that you might find at a street corner. You put your quarters in, you press a black button, you open up the door, and what do you see? Lo and behold, there's a stack of newspapers. Now, what is it that most normal people do? They take one newspaper and they let the door close behind them. Now, if they wanted to, of course, they could make off with all of the newspapers, but they just take the one and they let the door close. Now, I might ask you, why do most people do that? And of course, I'm likely to get a whole host of different kinds of answers to that question, and many of which would be perfectly fine. And that is, I'm sure some people might argue, well, you know, most people are honest, and so that's the reason. You know, they understand that they're only entitled to one newspaper. They've only put a certain number of quarters in the machine that entitles them to just the one newspaper, and so that's all they're going to take out. Well, that's, I guess, possible. In fact, actually, it's fairly reasonable, I suppose. But I think there's a more compelling reason, because it doesn't quite measure up against why the vending machines that sell soda are not dispensed in quite the same way. And my suspicion is that the reason really has to do with marginal utility. So I would sort of ask you this simple question. What really is the marginal utility of the second newspaper that's sitting inside that vending machine? Well, the answer is, for all intents and purposes, probably something very close to zero, if not completely zero. Dead zero. That is, it's telling you the same stories, there's the same articles, the same horoscope, the same weather report, the same sports, news. So what good would it be to acquire a second copy, unless you were going to cut out coupons, or unless you were going to sell the extra newspapers further down a few blocks away? So I think you can see the wisdom in that. That is, the marginal utility is zero, so well, you know, why get another one? So we let that door close behind us, and we grab our newspaper and we bring it home and we read it. Now notice the way that canned cold beverages or sodas are sold in vending machines. These are very different kinds of contraptions. Notice that when you put your 50 cents in, or your 75 cents, or your dollar, however much canned cold beverages might be going for nowadays, notice that the door doesn't open up for you to be able to unload all the soda that's there and bring it home with you. Kind of like the newspapers. It's not at all operated like that. In fact, what really happens is the canned cold beverage sort of slowly tumbles down. Part of the reason for that is to make sure the product doesn't explode upon you opening it. But the other reason for all of the fancy equipment is to keep prying hands away from the rest of the product. And that is, I think, the vendor of this soda machine clearly understands that the rest of the canned cold beverages that are sitting inside the machine have positive value. He's probably not thinking in terms of marginal utility, right? He's just a businessman, and he's not probably thinking in those sort of technical economic terms, but it's essentially what's going on. He recognizes that, shoot, the rest of those do have value to you. And so as a consequence, it might make sense to sort of keep the rest of those away from non-payers, hence the more complicated device. So that kind of explains a little bit about the law of diminishing marginal utility in a very practical way. Let's take a look at the substitution effect and relative prices. This is something that sometimes gets lost on people, and is often a concept that's very difficult to sort of get across. This business of relative price or real price. For example, we are now in the year 2006, and gas prices are hovering near the $3 mark, and it's difficult really to convince people that the real price of gasoline is still cheaper than it was 20 years ago. Because someone's likely to answer, well, wait a second, I was around 20 years ago, and in 1986, gas prices were, $1.20. So I don't see how the real price of gasoline can actually be cheaper. But see, that's an argument about the nominal price of gasoline, not the real price. Certainly $3 is not cheaper than $1.20. But what we're talking about here is real price reflects the price of gasoline compared to other things. And that is, if other goods and services have been rising at a faster clip, that is, the prices of other goods and services have been rising at a faster clip than has the price of gasoline, that actually makes gas relatively cheaper than those other goods. Right? Absolutely. And that's sort of what we mean by that. Now, of course, if gas prices rise to $3.50, then in all likelihood, the real price of gasoline really will be more expensive today than it was then. But if you adjust it for inflation, the real price of gasoline compared to gas prices in 1986 is still relatively cheaper. And so that's what we sort of mean by that. So nominal prices by themselves don't really tell us anything about how people are going to respond to changes in prices. People aren't just looking at the absolute price, they're looking at the price compared to the price of other goods and services that are in the economy. And then finally, let's take a look at the real income effect. Suppose I were to just tell you that an alien, from outer space lands on planet Earth in 1938 and interviews a German citizen and asks this German citizen, how much he makes per year, and the German citizen's responds by saying that he makes a million Deutschmarks a year. Now, of course, if this alien from outer space is an economist, he's likely to ask, well, what can that 1 million Deutschmarks get you in terms of, food and clothing and shelter? And if that German soldier responds by saying, well, it's enough to afford me a 300 square foot flat to live in, or apartment, and a couple of loaves and a gallon of milk a week in food, and barely pay the gas bill, well, then that alien from outer space, that economist, is likely to conclude that this German soldier is poor. What's the point here? The point here is that large figure of 1 million Deutschmarks doesn't really tell you anything. What we really want to know is, What is that in real terms? What can he really buy with that? That's really what we're getting at. So those numbers, those big numbers, can kind of hide information. Also, if the number were a lot lower, it might sort of make it sound like you are operating in poverty. But if I were to tell you, for example, that a nurse in the 1920s, made $6,000 a year, you might say, well, gee, that's poverty. Well, we'd have to remember, what is it that a nurse could purchase with $6,000 a year? And if you could live comfortably in a beautiful home and afford a car and entertainment and get out and go to fancy restaurants, then you know what the likely conclusion would be. So it's good to sort of keep all of those different effects in your head. The law of diminishing marginal utility, substitution effect, and the income effect all help explain why the demand curve slopes downward. Now, another sort of challenging element is this whole business about what affects demand. In fact, one of the trick questions that I like to ask students is, does price affect demand? And of course, the answer to that trick question is no. And it's a sort of surprising answer, because your first instinct is to say, well, of course price affects demand. If price goes up, I'm going to buy less, and if price goes down, I'm going to buy more. So where are you getting off saying that price doesn't affect demand? Well, what I mean is, it doesn't affect the position of the demand curve. It doesn't affect your overall tastes and preferences. Your demand curve is sitting still. So if there's a change in price, there's simply going to be a change not in demand itself, the position of the demand curve, but there'll be a change in the quantity demanded. That is, if price goes up, the quantity demanded will go down. If price goes down, the quantity demanded will rise, but the demand itself will remain the same. So then if price isn't a determinant of demand, then what kind of things are? Well, you can find those out in your textbook, but I'll lay them out for you. There's simple things like income, tastes and preferences, price of substitutes, price of complements. Notice I didn't say the price of the good itself, but the price of other goods, the price of a complement or the price of a substitute, or expectations. These, the number of consumers in the market. These are the kinds of things that can affect demand. So if our incomes go up, then naturally demand would go up. Why? There's greater purchasing power. If there are more consumers in a particular market, this will increase demand. If there's an expectation that the price of a particular good may fall in the future, then demand goes down, shifts to the left. We're going to want to buy less now in anticipation of falling prices. We'll buy more later when the price falls. That kind of thing. So that's what we're getting at. And all of this same kind of logic also applies to the supply side. So let's move over to that side. When we talk about the law of supply, what are we getting at? That when prices are low, firms really aren't all that excited about producing very much, so they don't. There's a low quantity supplied at low prices. And as prices rise, the quantity supplied moves up. Firms are motivated by the profit motive and tend to want to expand production. So you get this upward sloping sort of supply curve, the supply curve that moves up to the northeast if you're looking at a graph. So I could ask sort of the same question that I asked before about demand. What variable impacts the supply curve? And you might answer, and I think quite honestly, price. But again, that would also be wrong. Because all that happens with a change in price with respect to the supply curve is not a movement of the supply curve, but rather a change in the quantity supplied. That is, as prices fall, the quantity supplied goes down. As price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. But the supply curve sits still. It doesn't move. It doesn't move to the left. It doesn't move to the right. So then the next logical question to ask yourself is, well, what kind of things do cause the change in supply? Again, any good Principles of Economics book is going to have this laid down in the supply and demand chapter, but I'll give you a quick and dirty on that. Number of firms. If there are more firms in the market, supply curve moves to the right. If there are casualties, that is, firms go out of business, leave the market, supply moves to the left. If the good in question becomes more costly to produce, this causes the supply curve to shift to the left because of costs. So firms have to raise their prices at each level of quantity. If the good in question has a technological breakthrough, Well, this reduces cost of production because it improves productivity. This would shift the supply curve to the left. Or if there's a tax on the good, this would cause the supply curve to shift to the left. I may have made a mistake a moment ago with technology. If the technological improvement that lowers costs and that shifts the supply curve to the right. Sorry about that. What other things would cause a supply shift? How about a subsidy? Suppose that the government grants a subsidy for corn, for producing corn, wants to encourage farmers to produce more corn. Well, this actually causes the supply curve for corn to shift to the right. So all of these are factors that we call supply shifters, things that affect the supply curve and actually move the positioning of the supply curve. Now, when we bring all of these things together, sort of bring in the supply curve and bring in the demand curve, we see a downward sloping demand curve. When we see an upward sloping supply curve, then we can then sort of get a grasp at what the market's all about, how the market works. So I guess the first gut instinct would be to ask the following question. Where is equilibrium price and where is equilibrium quantity? And I think a quick student would likely to point out, well, that's where the two intersect, where supply and demand intersect, where they cross. And that intuitive answer is actually the correct answer. That's where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. That's equilibrium. But I think to really fully appreciate that answer, it's better to understand why any other price that yields a different outcome can't be the equilibrium condition. Now, why is it that the equilibrium price is the one where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded? Why couldn't it be a price where quantity supplied was greater than the quantity demanded, or vice versa? So let's take a simple case. Just imagine a supply and demand curve in your head, or maybe right now you might want to take out a piece of paper and actually draw it. Draw a vertical line and a horizontal line, and draw an upward sloping supply and a downward sloping demand. And then sort of pick an arbitrary price that you know is going to be above the equilibrium. And just call that, for right now, P2, and then make your little dotted line going over. And then sort of ask yourself, what kind of a condition is that? What's going on in this particular market? Well, I think it'd be useful just to look at that graph and say to yourself, well, at that high price, firms are really excited about producing. They want to produce a lot more, so they do. So move over to that supply curve and now draw a vertical dotted line downward and call that QS on the horizontal supply. And there's your quantity supplied. But now sort of ask yourself this question. At that high price, what do consumers want to do? Well, they want to buy a lot less. And certainly a lot less than the quantity that we just wrote down. Because we're now going to hit the demand curve and now come down vertically. And we want to label that quantity QD. Well, what do we notice here? What we notice is the quantity supplied is a lot bigger than the quantity demanded. And there's a simple way of sort of describing that in economics. We call that a surplus or excess supply. Now, what do you know is probably true about how managers are likely to respond to an excess supply of something when they have a lot more on their shelves than they had anticipated? Well, they have a sale. They lower prices. And as they lower prices, right, what happens? Well, quantity demanded goes up. As the quantity demand goes up, and of course the quantity supplied begins to shrink at those lower prices, and then of course the surplus evaporates until quantity supply and quantity demanded are in tandem once again, or equal. Now you might want to imagine sort of the flip side. Now pick another price, call it P1, but make sure that it's below the equilibrium price, below where the supply and demand curve meet. And draw another horizontal dotted line moving across the page. And when you hit the demand curve, now draw a vertical dotted line coming down. And label that one, of course, QS. I'm sorry, where it hits the supply curve. Label that QS. That's be quantity supply. Now move over to the demand curve, hit it, and bring it down and call that quantity demanded. Well, now you see the shoe's on the other foot. The quantity demanded actually exceeds the quantity supplied. And again, we have another sort of simple way of explaining what that's all about. That is really, plainly and simply, a shortage or excess demand. So when there is a shortage of something, that is when a retailer or a manager recognizes that goods and services are disappearing off the shelves, pretty quickly, or inventories are being drawn down fairly fast, then how are firms likely to respond to shortages? Well, they raise prices. And as they raise prices, they step up production, and then consumers economize on the good until what? Quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded once again. And so at that point of equilibrium is where the market is at a point of rest. Now I say a point of rest, but a point of rest at one particular time. And that is, of course, across time, there may be things that will disturb that equilibrium, shifts in demand or shifts in supply. Okay, we're going to close this lecture, but I would just urge you to sort of take the time to sort of draw out some of these things that I talked about in this audio lecture, or perhaps replay it once again if some of these concepts were a bit cloudy, and then actually go through certain scenarios on your own about how equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity might change if there were factors that affected demand and supply in either a positive or a negative way. And you might want to start off with demand first, do a positive shock and a negative shock, then do supply, do the same thing, positive shock and a negative shock. And then you might want to complicate things just a bit by introducing a scenario where there are factors that affect demand and supply simultaneously. Okay, that is the end of this mini lecture.